back. I'm not Andy.
I am definitely not Pastor
However, I got enough problems.
You are Pastor Mark. I'm Andy.
And Dave.
We talk about things that are counter-culture-ish, which usually happens more off the air than on the air. That we discuss fantastic things like beans with chunks of ham and
beans. Would that be ham and beans or would it be cowboy beans? In my case, it's cowboy beans.
I love it.
Sorry.
Love it.
Yeah.
All right, so we're in Christmas. This is going to come out hopefully Christmas Eve, if I can have my act together. So Christmas Eve.
So don't count on it, folks.
No, but
because he might be letting Christmas get in the way of Jesus' birthday.
Yesterday, you said something that goes along with it. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? People say that all that time.
I thought, okay.
But you said,
don't let Christmas get in the way of Jesus.
Don't let Christmas get in the way of Jesus' birth, right? So when we look at the Christmas story, it's a fascinating thing to me because we tend to focus on the part in Luke chapter 2 with just the Mary and Jesus and the shepherds part. But the Christmas story is so much bigger in nature. There's a lot more names actually than people think about. When you look at the Simeons and the Annas and you look at the Elizabeths and the Zacharias
and
right?
Nestor
and the
Nestor the Christmas donkey.
That's right. When you look at Nestor, right, and whatever the camels were named, and like you look at the story and we say God had a bigger plan, right? Than we sometimes just focus on. That's super important for us to think about counterculturalish, right? God has a bigger plan for you than you can imagine and you can think about, right? So this Christmas season, when we give, right, the $2 in the Salvation Army bucket, or we go help out here, we give somebody an extra tip here, we have no idea what
that's all you get.
Money is going to times to 20 times that you go from store to store to store to store. I finally, it used to be that I gave, an X amount in that little bucket, and then I would go to all the other stores and say, sorry, I've already donated. And then I went, no, I'm just going to break it up and take a bunch of ones and get $2 here and here and here and here. And
that way it looks better if people are watching.
I feel better about walking past the bucket. Right? So, anyway, there's more to the story. I want to look at Luke chapter 1. And it's a familiar part of the Christmas story called the birth of John the Baptist, right? I want you to start and read verse 57 and 58 for me. And I'm going to stop you there because that's all the further we'll get today.
When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy.
So I think it's very interesting when we look at this and we look at the plight of Elizabeth and look at the whole story. Because we do that with Mary, and we say, what must it have been like to be a young woman who was pregnant without a husband, and all these things. But here's Elizabeth, and she is older in nature, right? Zachariah's whole complaint to the Lord is, listen, my wife's old. Right.
And not that he was not old. It couldn't be him. It had to be her.
My wife is old.
It's her fault.
How can this be? She's an old hag.
Yeah.
Right? So we look at this and her neighbors, right? These other women, they would have had stuff to say about this whole thing, right? So if you were a woman in culture and you were noticing that another woman was not pregnant, had not had any kids yet, right? What are some of the brilliant deductions that you could have drawn from that perception?
Who sinned, her or her husband?
Fantastic.
And it had to have been her. That's probably why Zechariah talked to God the way he did.
Exactly.
Yep, there must be some
There has
problem.
to be a problem.
There's got to be a problem.
Right? The Bible, Old Testament, these people were still living under the Old Testament law, was very clear about that. God said, hey, you're not going to miscarriage. You're not going to be barren if you do right things, but if you do wrong things, this is going to be a problem. So they would have deducted, hey, Elizabeth must be a terrible person, right? Like she must have done something wrong to not have a child, right? So then you read what you read today, and it says that when she gets ready to have the birth, when she has the birth, all these women, all these neighbors, they come to her because they had heard through the gossip train that God finally had mercy on her and had given her a child, right? So I mentioned it today in my prayers, but I've been really stuck on this. There are times when we would declare something as God having mercy on somebody. But really, truly, in this instance, how would you know if it was God having mercy on Elizabeth or God having favor on Elizabeth, and he set her aside for such a time as this? Right? There are a lot of situations that we look at and we declare something over it, like, oh, yep, God finally gave them the job. They must have got the right thing together. Oh, God finally gave them a spouse. They were such a mess before. God finally gave them mercy and gave them God finally did this for them. They were such a wreck. But there is something to say about God sometimes sets things aside, people aside, and that's favor. Elizabeth was actually favored by God. Not God had mercy necessarily on her because she had been doing wrong things. So how first, what do you think about that? Second, how do we know? How do we know when it's a mercy thing and when it's a favor thing?
Right. And is it a mercy thing or a favor thing?
Yep. Fantastic.
This story reminds me of like when David's kid died.
Yeah.
And they thought, well, this was God's punishment for whatever. Why'd the kid have to take the punishment? Take David out. He's the one that did it, Mm-hmm. I remember when I was taking a class in seminary and we were discussing that. And, my take was that was their perception.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're exactly right with this. Maybe the last thing an older lady needed was a baby to chase around.
Maybe.
I'm 58.
Yep.
And I can't imagine having my wife have a baby right now because I wouldn't have the energy to keep up with it. Now, in those days, maybe it was a little different.
Mm-hmm.
They would have had to give them something else other than an iPad to sit with or something like that, But sometimes what we think is a blessing. My wife and I don't have children. No, that has, we've been robbed of a few things,
Mm-hmm.
but we've also been spared a lot of heartache.
Mm-hmm.
And so was God merciful to us, or was His grace and favor upon us, or was there something wrong?
Right.
Don't answer that, please.
Well, there's something wrong.
Yeah, it isn't my wife. They're like, we can't handle another kid like Mark running around.
You and Zachariah might have something.
Yeah. So I think you asked me the question, and I think we have to be careful,
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a cultural piece of this. Now, as a Wesleyan, I go by the Wesleyan, try to go by the Wesleyan quadrilateral: scripture, tradition, reason, and experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I can look at this and say, well, tradition, and that you could probably argue with that with this, I'm thinking, is their tradition said, well, there's a problem because she didn't have the kid.
Mm-hmm.
That's not necessarily so.
No.
That's not necessarily so. There's an old story you probably heard of the guy they had, like in the Middle East or something. He had a bunch of horses, and storm came up and scared the horses. They broke the corral and they took off. His neighbor said, "Oh, this is bad. This is bad." He goes, "Well, we'll see." Well, the horses come back, as you know, horses normally get fed. They come back and they bring a stallion with them. And his neighbor, "Oh, this is good. You now you have a stallion. You can breed the horses and whatever." And the guy said, "Well, we'll see." And the stallion's not broken, so someone's got to break the stallion. The guy's a little bit older, so he puts his son up on the horse. The horse throws it, breaks his arm. "Oh, this is bad. Who's going to break your stallion for you?" We want the neighbors to do it. We don't want them to step up and do it.
They're commentating on this.
Yeah, they're commentating on the whole thing. So he goes, "Well, we'll see." Well, war breaks out. The army comes through, gathering up all the able-bodied young men. His son's got a broken arm. He can't do it. And they said, "This is good. We'll see." I've often talked about there's like three buckets. There's a good bucket, a bad bucket, and then there's this middle bucket. We'll see.
Let's see.
We like to judge it. Oh, this is a bad thing.
Yep.
And when we judge whatever this thing was, and sometimes things are bad, some things are good. We know that. But sometimes we have to look and say, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see what God's going to do with it. Either way.
Which is most of my Christian life. I don't know about yours. Is it now? We'll see bucket.
Yeah. I live in the we'll see bucket.
Do people come to church? And people are immediately like, oh, this is great, we're growing.
We'll see. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
People start leaving, we're like, oh, the world's ending.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, exactly. And so when I read this, yes, that was, God gives us the desires of our heart. My friend Roy Miller says this, and then He gives us the desires of our heart as we delight ourselves in God, who is should be our ultimate desire of our heart. But Elizabeth and Zechariah both continued to serve God and said, we're going to serve God no matter what happens. And God gave them the desire of their heart. They wanted this kid. Of course, we'll say, the Chosen calls him Creepy John.
Yep.
This kid's a renegade. And it's like, okay, but he became a great renegade. And so for the Lord. So I think sometimes we have to be careful what we deem as merciful and what we don't, and what we deem as grace and what we don't. That's a sticky wicket to be. Say, well, this is a good. Not everything that glitters is gold.
Yep.
A friend of mine who pastored, big church and is not pastoring right now, and has talked about how he missed pastoring a small church.
Yeah.
Yep. And being with the people, he was with people, but it was his leadership. He wasn't with the people that he was ministering to.
Yep.
And there's something to say for that.
Amen.
So.
Amen.
I think what comes to my mind is I think we have to be careful because counterculture, our culture judges very much instantaneously. And, you must have voted for Trump, or you must have voted for Kamala Harris, or you must be this, you must be that. Oh, you're a Baptist, you must think this. Not necessarily. You're a Wesleyan, you must think that. Not necessarily. Why don't you ask me? Why don't we talk about it before we start making judgments about something? And we do it all the time with, we're all, from a perspective of, they're dark complected, they must be Hispanic, and therefore they must be a migrant. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think we make a lot of judgments, and the very thing that we get criticized for as Christians is making judgment, which we all have judgments. It's what we do with them.
I love that. So I wanna leave it right here for this episode, and I wanna pick up it because the rest of this story is gonna play into the wait and see concept. So it's a perfect transition. So chew on that for a minute. Maybe there's some things that you have declared as, oh, God's having mercy. Maybe that's not God having mercy. Maybe God's been waiting to share favor. Maybe you've declared things that are favor and God's showing mercy, and maybe you're excited about mercy, and maybe you're wishing now that it shouldn't have been, right? Or you've declared favor, and you're like, I needed mercy, not favor.
Yeah.
Right? But no matter where you are on that, it's great this Christmas time to just really chew on this whole thing, right? Are you, again, I encourage you to go listen to Chasing the Wind and listen to that, are you letting Christmas get in the way of Jesus, right? This whole concept is super important this Christmas. We'll see you next time right here on Counterculture.
Grace and peace.